A very good evening to you all. I am a great believer and an advocate. I believe in technology, so I came prepared. Everything is here. But I also backed it up on paper. So we're safe. Permit me to stand on existing protocols. And I'd like to thank the teams from the University of Johannesburg's Faculty of Management and the Dr. Richard Maponya Institute for the hard work that they have put over the past few months to make today's lecture a reality. We are here this evening at the instance of the Institute, which is a civic organization that was founded by Dr. Maponya to contribute to finding solutions to the current high levels of unemployment in South Africa. And I think it's a very fitting legacy for Dr. Maponya to create a platform like this and to bequeath that to the nation, given his extraordinary rise to success in the face of formidable obstacles and his incredible work ethic. Long before, and this is an interesting thing about life, long before I came in contact with the Institute, I had been studying up on Dr. Maponya and the mayor, the executive mayor as well, Mr. Mashaba. And some of Dr. Maponya's quotes that I find very fascinating and that I've sort of taken into research and looking at mindsets and all of that. I'll give you a few of them. He said, "I am not impressed with the exchange and buying of shares that do not create jobs. I would like to see people start up something and create hundreds of jobs. That for me will be real empowerment, enabling large numbers of people to put bread on the table and develop skills." And that's what entrepreneurs do. When they go out, when they face obstacles, when they crack codes, society benefits. People are able to put food on the table. Here's the one that really gets me. In a newspaper interview, he also said, "I cannot retire. Retire and do what? I believe that for as long as I am alive and healthy, I must do whatever I can to benefit my community. I will work until the day they sing Hamburgatli. I will die with my boots on." And it wasn't just mere talk. Because my first meeting with him was a few months ago at when the Institute signed a partnership agreement with the Brazilian State Agency for Vocational Education. And he was sharing with people there about some of the other plans, the development, and you start wondering, okay, so when is he ever going to slow down? And I know that he had that conversation with us this evening as well about things that he had wanted to do. So it's interesting and it's an absolute delight to be able to participate in this. This lecture, the other activities of the Institute and the Maponya Group's sustained business engagements over the years have demonstrated that Dr. Maponya remains committed to these sentiments today, as he was when he first ventured out in business in the mid-50s, when he spotted gaps and opportunities, found solutions to problems, overcame challenges and obstacles. And perhaps one of the highlights of his illustrious business career was the establishment of the Maponya Mall. And I understand that was a dream that he nursed for 26 years. But it has happened. And it's created jobs, it's created business opportunities, and it is contributing to the economic development of Soweto. So I agree with you that he is a source of inspiration for many individuals, not just in South Africa, but across the continent, and I believe across the world. I would also want to say a few things about the Global Entrepreneurship Week, because I believe the annual lecture is an activity that is one of the activities celebrating the Global Entrepreneurship Week. And I quote directly from the people who originated the week. And they said that during 1 week, each November, entrepreneurs, researchers, investors, and policymakers celebrate entrepreneurship in more than 150 countries for the Global Entrepreneurship Week. And in 2016, the Global Entrepreneurship Week will focus on several themes and highlight high growth, high impact disruptors while encouraging new firms to start and scale. If we pause for a moment, I think we can all do in this economy and in economies across the continent. We can do with high impact disruptors. We can do with having a larger number of startups. And we can do with having those who have started and are employing 2, 3, 4 people to begin to scale and provide employment for 20, 30, hundreds and thousands of people. So those themes appear to me to be particularly important. And one of the themes is to celebrate female entrepreneurs. One of the themes for this year's week is to celebrate female entrepreneurs and others in the space, while also offering them opportunities to expand their networks, identify resources, and share knowledge with women around the world. That sounds like something that's vital in this economy, given the legislation to support females to come into entrepreneurship. Another theme has to do with the youth and how we can shape the next generation of entrepreneurs through activities and competitions to help them sharpen their skills and connect them to potential co-founders, mentors, and investors. There's also a theme that addresses investors, and that provides an opportunity for early-stage investors to build and strengthen their entrepreneurial ecosystems. Now, if there is a phrase, if there are 2 words that you are going to hear a lot of tonight, it's those words, entrepreneurial ecosystem. I hope you don't get bored when you hear it and hear it several times. But the idea is to help those investors to enhance connections with startup communities and policymakers. Another theme explores the widespread efforts by policymakers and startup communities to support the development of local entrepreneurs and ensuring that they have access to the connection and the resources necessary to help them launch new startups that provide jobs, generate wealth, and disrupt local industries. That tells me something else. That when nations, when provinces, when institutions, when cities promote entrepreneurship, it's not so that we want to create a job for one man. It's not so that we want to get one man off the street. That's a kind of necessity-driven entrepreneurship. That's self-employment. But the purpose behind and the focus of developing entrepreneurial programs is to create sizable operations that can grow and provide employment for people. One key takeaway that I'd like us to go away with is, and that sounds a bit contradictory coming from somebody who promotes entrepreneurship. Not everybody will be an entrepreneur. Not everybody is cut out to be an entrepreneur. But the people who are not cut out to be entrepreneurs, we must find something. We must find work. We must create the systems, the environment for them to be able to work, because they have skills that they can bring to the workplace too. But that has a flip side. For those who do have the traits and can be entrepreneurs, how do we recognize them and spot those traits, nurture those traits early enough? It appears to me that our education systems, and I make no exception, South Africa, other parts of the world, education systems nowadays mostly tend to stifle thinking, exploration, the culture of inquiry, which are the absolute non-negotiables behind every successful entrepreneurial venture. We were told a few minutes ago to recall when we go for Medicaid or we buy glasses, that those things started as ideas. There's an entire process for developing a concept from idea to the market shelf. What do we do and what can we do better to enhance the society's capacity to ensure that more ideas don't die in the graveyard of frustration, that more people can come to market, more products can come to market? We need disruption in virtually every segment of our lives. And the last theme, and I'm not talking about our individual lives, I'm just saying that as a society, insurance industry, auto industry, we need disruption, because we've all benefited from the disruptions that have happened in other industries. Scale-ups, which is to explore what it takes for high potential businesses to thrive and what strong entrepreneurial ecosystems can do to help them to maximize their growth potential. Having said that, I'd like to also bring to your notice that Johannesburg is the host city for the Global Entrepreneurship Congress in March 2017. How many of us are aware of that fact? Excellent. So now we all know. And the value of knowing early and knowing now is, how do we work between now and then to utilize that stage, that platform, to draw attention to issues around entrepreneurship, promoting the development of an entrepreneurship culture in South Africa? The significance of this lecture becomes more obvious when we situate Dr. Maponya's ideals as represented in the mission of the Institute within the context of the Global Entrepreneurship Week's objectives. South Africa needs to grow the level of entrepreneurial activity in the country to be able to address the chronic challenge of unemployment and underemployment. According to Simodisa, which is an industry association, and it goes by the tag that it's an industry association by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs, they say that small and medium-scale enterprises employ 60% of South Africa's workforce and contribute roughly 34% of the GDP. Our task is to find a way of using Dr. Maponya's entrepreneurial DNA to catalyze the development of an entrepreneurial mindset in the youth of South Africa, so we can have more people starting and growing businesses and creating employment opportunities for other people in the process. With that as the background, I'd like to explore the current state of play in the South African entrepreneurship environment. And very often, there's a holy grail that we all refer to when we measure entrepreneurial activity. It's the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which tracks activities in countries across the world based on certain parameters. And GEM records South Africa as having persistently low levels of entrepreneurial activity compared to other countries. And I'm quoting from the report for 2015-2016. The GEM studies focus on two elements in every economy that they study. First, they look at the entrepreneurial behavior and attitudes of individuals. And second, the national context and how it impacts entrepreneurship. So let's do a quick survey. Let's take a quick scan of entrepreneurship profiles comparing South Africa with other countries. The first profile I'd like to talk about is within the BRICS community. And we have a key indicator. The most popular key indicator is the one that talks about early stage entrepreneurial activity. How often, how many companies do we bring to life? It's called the total entrepreneurial activity. Brazil records 17.2%. Russia stands at 4.7%, India 6.6%, China at 14%, and South Africa 7%. It came in slightly higher than Russia and is at par with India. But we need to factor the fact that India has a population in the billion-man range. Established business ownership. South Africa has the lowest rate of 2.7% in the BRICS community. It also has the fourth lowest in terms of entrepreneurial intentions, standing at 10%, while Brazil is at 25% and China is at 14%. If we then compare with a number of other countries in Africa, South Africa has the lowest rate when we compare with Egypt, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Namibia. For total entrepreneurship activity, and it also has the lowest rate when compared with established business ownership. For perceived opportunities, there is a wide gap between South Africa, which is at 37%, and Namibia, which is standing at 75%, Ethiopia at 65%, Nigeria at 82%, Egypt at 54%. Here's the one that I'd really like to focus on, the fear of failure, which has been seen as being a main inhibitor preventing people from launching entrepreneurial careers. Fortunately, the story is not all that bad here. South Africa stands at 25%, compared with Egypt at 33%, Nigeria at 21%, Ethiopia also at 33%, and Namibia at 35%. When we take a look at those indicators, we find that if we compare with some economies in Africa and in the BRICS community, there appears to be a challenge with the entrepreneurial culture in South Africa. It does not appear to be as vibrant as those of the other countries that we've spoken about, all things considered. And that profile, when we compare it with other countries, that profile, it actually stands in stark contrast to the enormity of efforts and resources that are daily going into promoting entrepreneurship in South Africa. Governments at local, provincial, and national levels have programs to support the development of entrepreneurship. And at the national level, we've got institutions like the Department of Small Business Development, which was created about 2 years ago. We've got the Department of Trade and Industry bringing big corporate organizations into the process of supporting entrepreneurship. We have institutions like CIFA, the NYDA, and we have CEDA as well. And we've got this legislation for black economic empowerment. If we look at what corporate bodies are doing, quite a sizable number of them have preferential supply and procurement initiatives. Between them and NPOs, we have a myriad of incubators, of accelerators, skill development, and access to finance initiatives. So it can't be for lack of effort. It can't be for want of a program. There is a surfeit of effort. There is almost an overload of activities. What then seems to be the problem? Why is the uptake low? And the rate is lower in the black community. And several reasons have been adduced for this. I'll give you this quote from an organization called the Action Appointments Development Recruitment. They say South Africa is facing dangerous levels of youth unemployment, and yet no large-scale public programs exist to address this issue specifically. The public employment programs in South Africa, such as the Extended Works Program and the Community Works Program, while providing much-needed income and work for many unemployed people, and safety nets, which are not designed to transfer skills and future opportunities to the post-school youth most vulnerable to becoming victims of the 60% structural unemployment affecting young people in South Africa. Now, I find that very curious, and I think it's something that we should interrogate. Because in the previous paragraph, we were talking about the volume and level of activity of organizations that exist on a national scale. The NYDA is represented across, they've got offices across the 9 provinces. In Gauteng, the Gauteng Enterprise Propeller has quite a number of offices across the province. So why are we saying that we do not have no large-scale public program? It looks to me like there is still a gap that we are yet to identify. And the question for me is, why are we talking about the lack of large-scale interventions when we already have this myriad of schemes and programs that we've mentioned earlier? And research conducted by sociologists on the lack of entrepreneurial activity among the black population, they presented 5 patterns of explanations for this. The first is, they say there is an explanation in terms of historical apartheid explanation, financial resources explanation, human capital explanation, traits and mindset, and then a social capital and network explanation. The paper they wrote is called In Search of Black Entrepreneurship, and I believe there were academics from different universities who collaborated. The paper was published in 2011. And they posit that the historical apartheid explanation cannot be qualified independently of the other explanations. And here's the catch, that most of the focus has been on financial resources and human capital challenges, that those are the two most mentioned facts when people want to adduce reasons for the lack of uptake for entrepreneurship in the country. And I say again, when we look at the legislations, the programs, and the schemes, it does appear to me that significant levels of efforts have gone into addressing factors of historical apartheid, factors of financial resources and human capital. What we may not have addressed sufficiently are the issues of traits and mindset, and those of social capital and network. Most of the programs that we see tend to speak to finance, to capital, and to training. And we'll get to training later. Because that's my comfort zone, I deliberately restrained myself from dwelling extensively on that bit. I'm also going to quote from a report by the HRDC. The report was published in 2013, and it's called the Enabling Entrepreneurship Technical Task Team Final Report. It came out in August 2013. And they say that entrepreneurship is a national development issue, which is imperative for an inclusive and growing economy. Currently, there are a myriad of entrepreneurship education and training initiatives, but these efforts are to a large extent uncoordinated in their provision and lack standardization and effectiveness. There is a low conversion rate from training to small enterprise or cooperative startup compared to peer economies. And little is done to better understand and measure the impact of entrepreneurship training in fostering business startups. So we're talking about a disconnect. It's not for lack of effort, it's not for lack of enthusiasm, as much as we recognize the fact that access to capital can pose an hindrance to some people, and at the risk of sounding controversial, it is actually not a question of access to capital. At the root of the challenge that the HRDC is exploring is a mindset issue. It's a trait issue. And there are times when we think that by overcompensating in one or two areas, those other challenges will sort of disappear, but they don't. Now, that's not to suggest that there was a deliberate intention to say, look, we're not going to talk to traits or mindset. It could simply be lack of awareness that we didn't know that it was posing, or those were posing problems. If we then take that as the context, the current state of play that we're going to build upon, how do we go about developing an entrepreneurial ecosystem within South Africa that will enable us to give birth to more startups? And if I borrow your words, that's going to make entrepreneurship cool. Because when we talk about traits and mindset, we also look at culture. And if you ask young people the careers that they want to pursue, A question might be, how many of them, what percentage will say, I'd like to be an entrepreneur? I think that it's relatively clear that the issues that we have to deal with are those of harmonizing and aligning interventions around a set of core objectives that we can scale up. So it's not that we don't have interventions. It's not that we don't have programs. But we're not moving the needle because those programs are not operating on scale and they are not gaining traction, sufficient traction. From training provision, infrastructure, access to finance, and ongoing support, I believe there are pockets of very interesting and useful activities that's going on all around us in South Africa. But the challenge is, how do we bring all of this together to focus on a common objective? How do we ensure effective collaboration and linkages between the role players in the ecosystem? And the gap that we have to mind is the need to ensure that efforts are aligned and that outcomes reflect the volume of work that is going on and that interventions match the scale of the challenge. And that's where the development of an entrepreneurial ecosystem becomes very important. And the starting point to building an ecosystem, it's the same way one builds a house. It's the same way one builds a car. You first of all do a design. But given the fact that we're not bringing something new, it's completely different from building a new house or building a new car. We're talking about issues of alignment and misalignment. So what takes the place of a fresh build design in that context is a mapping exercise. So how do we map? How do we collate and classify the assets and role players? As I proceed further, I'm going to bring up several issues and talk to some occurrences in the systems that will probably shed more light on some of these alignment issues. How do we classify role players who are engaged in promoting entrepreneurship? How do we share knowledge and adopt common standards? Remember, the HRDC spoke to the issue of lack of standardization in entrepreneurship education. How do we focus on a set of key priorities that most of these disparate activities can feed into? And how can we create linkages between programs so as to enhance the reach and effectiveness of such programs? It's crucial that we foster an environment where meaningful conversations are taking place between the different role players in the sector, and where collaborations are being promoted so that the different segments are aligned towards the same goal. And that is the reason why, in spite of the volume of activity, in spite of the myriad of legislations, in spite of the capital, the number of agencies that are involved in this process, the uptake rate is still very low. In a lot of the peer economies that we compare South Africa with, they do not have an NYDA. They do not have any government-supported, supplier-mandated program or anything that says you must patronize small business. They do not have the CEDAs, the CFAs. But entrepreneurship is thriving. And when I said I'm very familiar with Dr. Maponya's journey, and I'm also very familiar with the mayor's journey. Because it's been, over the years, it's been something I had dwelt on to say, okay, so what was it in the water that people like Dr. Maponya and Mr. Mashaba were drinking in those days that suddenly is no longer available today? Sparkling water. What was it in the food that they were eating that is suddenly unavailable today? Because we can sit down today and not, it's the person who walked a journey who is in a position to actually say how the journey was like. I run several businesses, but I don't run any business where, I've never run any business where I've had to contend with state-sponsored obstruction. And we're talking about individuals who found ways. Starting a business is hard enough. It's tough work. It's back-breaking work. But when you have to start a business and you have to contend with obstructions, deliberate obstructions, intentional obstructions, so you are fighting on multiple fronts, it is only an individual of a certain kind who can cope with the business challenges, cope with the curved balls that the state is throwing, and still succeed. When you look at those days, and we fast forward to today, with the BEE legislation, with everything corporates have to do to support small business, with a myriad. I have access to maybe 2 or 3 compilations in terms of the number of accelerators and business support programs, and the sheer scale and breadth of accelerators and incubators across South Africa is enormous. Yet there was no accelerator and incubator in the 50s when Dr. Maponya started. So in spite of all these support programs, why isn't the rate of uptake high? So there is a clear recognition of the need to have an entrepreneurial ecosystem in South Africa, both by the public and private sectors. And it's interesting because the state recognizes the need for it, private sector recognizes the need for it, NPOs recognize the need for it, but nobody seems to be steering the boat. The HRDC report I quoted earlier highlighted the significant levels of unemployment in South Africa and stressed the importance of entrepreneurship in driving economic development. And they say that in order for this to happen, a culture of entrepreneurship needs to become part of the South African culture, and especially among young people, in order for the country to create a new wave of entrepreneurs. Society needs to encourage students to recognize and take advantage of their inherent entrepreneurial potential and value successful entrepreneurs from all walks of life, including social entrepreneurs who apply enterprising principles to deal with society's challenges as much as successful formal business people. Here is where it gets interesting. They go on to make other recommendations, and the part that really stands out was the clear recognition of the role that is played by the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And they say an entrepreneurial culture is established through the effective working together of all the components of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, namely government, educational institutions, civil society, and business. So here's what we did. And here's what we could have done. without building a base, without creating a culture, without advocating the elements that should have been the foundation, we went into process making by setting up institutions, legislations, and other things. But then it's only with the benefit of hindsight that you can say, here's what we could have done. So I'm not saying it was I'm not sure it could have happened any other way. The dean was saying to me that in developing entrepreneurship programs here, that the faculty made lots of mistakes. And I said, that's the way to go. We shouldn't have any problem with making mistakes. We should actually promote a culture where people can experiment and where it is safe to fail. The thing we need to realize about the fear of failure, it's not really failure that is the hindrance or the challenge for many people. It is to be perceived by the environment as failures. So the fear that they have is not intrinsic, it's not sitting in the failure itself. It is how will family look at me. And those are things that we need to start speaking to. Government needs to set the vision and drive the change. Schools, colleges, and universities need to provide a learning environment and entrepreneurial thinking, attitudes, and intentions. Critical thinking skills. The sparkling water, and we should conduct some research on that people like Dr. Maponya and Mr. Mashaba had in those days must have given them the extraordinary capability to just see gaps. And when they see those gaps, what they saw were opportunities. Our education system today teaches young people, or doesn't teach them. There's an omission rather. And that omission results in when people see gaps today, they see obstacles, they see challenges, they see things to back away from. They don't see the opportunities to be taken advantage of. And we have to change that. Civil society can develop innovative approaches to implementation in communities and through extramural activities and business. And business, both big and small, needs to support the changes through partnerships with startup ventures, education institutions in their communities. And I should add that civil society groups, the NPOs, in addition to carrying out training and support activities for aspiring and current entrepreneurs, also have a big role to play in advocacy and celebrating entrepreneurship in the society. We don't celebrate entrepreneurs enough. We don't take the message to the grassroots enough. We need to celebrate our success stories. We need to showcase the local entrepreneurs who have risen and are doing well. And we need to be able to, the education system with the regulation and the curriculum challenges and everything may not be able to fully do this, but by partnerships with NPOs, we can begin to give more life to entrepreneurship education in our school system. And I think another key aspect of that report was the realization of the cross-cutting nature of what is required in terms of a policy framework to effectively develop the South African ecosystem, because it identified roles for different stakeholders, particularly from the side of the government. We've got the Department of Basic Education has a role to play. The Department of Higher Education and Training also has a role to play. The arrowhead has to be the Department of Small Business Development. But the DTI, which effectively coordinates other economic activities, also has a role to play. So how do we bring all of this together? Because there are times when one legislation comes, and maybe because we're not seeing the traction that we thought we were going to see, something else begins to happen somewhere else, and we create multiple platforms that are trying to do the same thing, and they are all not gaining traction. I particularly want to take note of something that the DSBD, that's the Small Business Development Department, is doing this year to give leadership to shaping conversations on policies affecting entrepreneurship development in South Africa. There is a move ongoing at the moment to review the National Small Business Act, and they've held a series of workshops. Now, because we have not crystallized this ecosystem into a formal mode, how many role players had the opportunity to engage with the DSBD in those workshops and actually contribute to the review of the Small Business Act? They also held a National Stakeholder Summit, which is a step in the right direction that hopefully should lead to the formalization of an ecosystem. I'm watching my words here because there is an ecosystem. So I don't want to give the impression that there is no ecosystem. What we don't have yet is that formal realization by all the role players that indeed we belong to an ecosystem and we need to start talking to one another. But the ecosystem is there and we're all role players in it. So it would be incorrect if we say that no effort has gone into developing the ecosystem. Again, let me quickly find out. I know that Simodisa and the Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs, in collaboration with PricewaterhouseCoopers, exactly 1 year ago, they produced a map of the South African entrepreneurial ecosystem. How many of us have seen that map? You have. Without a formal structure to support the ecosystem, such activities will largely go unnoticed and unrecognized. And that's the challenge. It's a critical first step because on a visual graphic representation, you can see a number of the role players and the sectors in which they play in promoting entrepreneurship. They listed finance providers, organizations that provide support in the ecosystem, capacity development, and the map also classified entrepreneurial activities in South Africa into ideation, startup, early stage, accelerating, and the growth stages for funding purposes. They then identified gaps, which they say include mismatch between capacity support and funding. And here's the one that we've been talking about: the fragmented nature of available support. If I take you back to what the HRDC said, they spoke about fragmented nature of training and support. And the other group, the advocacy group, they said there is no large-scale program. It is simply that most of the programs that exist operate in silos, and that's what this group is referring to as the fragmented nature. It's a critical first step, but here's the thing: we can then go quiet because we've produced a map. And not all the people who ideally need to access that map and benefit from it have even heard about it. That's one step that should be followed by then going granular. Because when we produce a map of a country's ecosystem on a national level, the outcome is not very actionable. And the fundamental reason why we produce entrepreneurial ecosystem maps is to then see the gaps and then create development programs to plug those gaps specifically. But because of the economic diversity that exists within the country, when you produce a national level map, you can't have the operational level view to be able to then say, here are targeted interventions. So after that first step, we then need to say, can we produce a map of the enterprise ecosystem in Gauteng? Can we produce a map of the ecosystem in Johannesburg? Because it is at that level, when we are close to the ground, close to the coal face, that we can then begin to design specific interventions and development programs to meet those needs. In talking about the South African entrepreneurship ecosystem, I had spoken about the fact that through the HRDC, we believe that the government recognizes the need for an ecosystem. And through the efforts of Simodisa, ANDE, and PwC, the first tentative step towards formalizing the ecosystem has gone into play. We now have a map. I have a third example which demonstrates the appreciation for developing the entrepreneurial ecosystem in South Africa. And that was the launch 2 years ago of a local chapter here in South Africa of the international organization called Startup Nations. So yes, November 2014, Startup Nations South Africa was established. And its mission is to spark, to seed, and to sustain a vibrant entrepreneurship culture in the country. It was established through a partnership between the Innovation Hub, Industrial Development Corporation, and the Wits Business School. Remember, I had mentioned issues of alignment earlier on. Let's begin to draw those things closer. So here we have Startup Nations South Africa. And in the exact same space, we have Simodisa, whose missions are broadly similar. But I am not sure that both organizations are talking to one another. I'm not sure that they are collaborating. Because there is nothing that Startup Nations is doing that shows that the map produced by Simodisa and its partners, they are putting it to use. I won't be surprised if another group comes up to then produce another map. So our key requirement is to be able to strengthen collaboration, because that appears to be the aspect that is required now in order to optimize the results from the various activities that are currently being undertaken at different levels to support entrepreneurial growth. It's not for lack of activities. It's not for a lack of programs. It's not for a lack of organizations, and it's certainly not for a lack of manpower. We've seen so many, but we are seeing fragmented operations. And I'm going to say something now that you would also hear me harp on. Please bear with me. I believe it's very important. We also do not have enough catalysts and amplifiers so that some of these interventions can gain traction. So what should happen when a Simodisa has partnered with a PwC and ANDE to produce a map of the South African entrepreneurial ecosystem? If we have catalysts and amplifiers, they then take that map that has been produced and they make sure that all relevant stakeholders and role players are aware that this resource exists for them to use. And I also want to quickly jump back to the HRDC report, because it also stated the need for effective collaboration between role players in the ecosystem. And it says that the ecosystem is a system of mutually beneficial and self-sustaining relationships involving institutions, people, and processes that work together with the goal of creating entrepreneurial ventures. So what we have to do is to begin to foster that culture of interaction and collaboration. I will quickly take you to, as a build-up to fostering that culture, my best resource is Professor Daniel Isenberg, who is widely regarded as an expert on research into entrepreneurial ecosystems. And he wrote a paper on how to start an entrepreneurial revolution. It was published in the Harvard Business Review, and it gives us some clues. First, there is no magic formula or prescription. So yes, we are going to make a few mistakes. We'll then work our way backwards. Only practical, if imperfect, roadmaps. And this is where events and occasions like the annual lecture becomes important, where we can take stock of what's going on and where we can share ideas to say, okay, so what haven't we been doing well, or how can we do it better? Isenberg also gave some recommendations, which include shaping the ecosystem around local conditions, engaging the private sector from the start, again, celebrating successes, favoring high potential businesses simply because they have the capacity to hire more people, and create more jobs. Reinforcing and building on existing clusters, tackling cultural change head-on, and reforming legal and regulatory frameworks. When we apply this to the South African scene, it's clear that the private sector has been part of the journey, because he did recommend that the private sector should be a player right from the outset. And government has also, to some extent, done some work. What's not so clear is if the emerging ecosystem has been deliberately shaped around local conditions, intentionally shaped around local conditions. Because if it had been addressing cultural issues, addressing traits and mindset issues, addressing social networks issues, would have been top on the priority list. So I will go to traits and mindsets. How can we tackle this challenge? I believe it's first through the review of the current entrepreneurship education and training curriculum, and also by promoting the status of entrepreneurship as a career option. Some of us may also know that the Department of Higher Education and Training is currently in the process of developing a career guidance framework for South Africa. It's a very important piece of work, and role players in the ecosystem should be part of shaping that conversation, because it is through that framework, when it is developed, that we can mainstream entrepreneurship intentionally as a career option. And the missing link in today's curriculum appears to be, because it appears to be largely focused on teaching business management skills, and it has omitted the need to cultivate an entrepreneurial mindset. We teach people how to manage small businesses, but we don't tell them how to generate ideas. And without the ideas, there is no business to run. The idea has to come first before the skills to manage a business. Thank you. We should also celebrate success stories, particularly at the local levels. And again, I say this, we need more catalysts and amplifiers who can enrich the curriculum by bridging the gaps between the classrooms and the real world, and by discovering and creating outreach programs for successful local entrepreneurs to share their experiences with students and others. Let's quickly address the second major challenge, social capital and network. Most of our youth are not plugged into networks. They don't have social capital. I'm not worried about access to finance, because many people built businesses on shoestring budgets. But without access to information, without knowing what is taking place, what is happening, people can't even get started. It doesn't just affect entrepreneurs, it also limits the youth, their chances of getting jobs, because they don't have information, they don't know who's hiring. And it takes having a social capital. That helps us to do things like that. And the best way for us to address that challenge is through technology. We can actually leapfrog. We have people sitting in their homes who don't belong to clubs and institutions that they could tap information from. But with technology, individuals can access information, they can access training opportunities, and they can begin to build virtual networks. And they can also access a marketplace online. I'll give you a very quick example of the nature of the challenge. Samsung chose South Africa as one of the countries for its Launching People campaign and mixed talents competition. And this involved getting youth being mobilized to contribute business ideas into an online ideas bank. The NYDA and Microsoft also have a portal called Youth Works. It's for employability. All these things exist in silos, different pockets. Imagine the scale that we can build if we get these two programs to talk to one another. And if we get more people to buy into one gateway that they can then use to access different opportunities. We also need to bring into play the value that can be derived from the free Wi-Fi program that I know that local governments have started to offer. Now, if we don't look at it from an ecosystemic perspective, there is free Wi-Fi. Of what benefit, to what use can the youth put it? If they are able to access these training programs that we've spoken about, to develop a marketplace online, and to search for jobs, we find that we are giving them access. But the challenge will then be, with all these things that are existing in microcosms, how do they know where to go? I'm going to quickly jump over to the summary and conclude. But my last word on the use of technology is that it had long been realized that technology, the virtual world, can enable us to sidestep constraints and physical barriers. I want to remind you of a program that was launched in 2005 by a gentleman named Nicholas Negroponte in the US. It was called the One Laptop Per Child Initiative. And the idea was to put a very cheap laptop in the hands of youth and children in rural communities who lack access to educational opportunities. So today we have youth who live in silos. They lack access to business and job opportunities. And if we expand the scale and the volume of internet access, we can then begin to address that problem. So as I begin to close, my summary and the takeaway would be, it should be possible to build further on the pioneering work that has been carried out by Simodisa, PwC, and ANDE on mapping the South African entrepreneurial ecosystem. We have not identified all the role players. How do we bring everybody on board into the same game? The name is collaboration. We need to foster a culture of collaboration where all role players are talking to one another, where we are aware of what the other person is doing. The second one for me will be coordination. So from collaboration, we also need coordination. We can't have an ecosystem that runs itself. We've got to have key stakeholders, like the Department of Small Business Development, like the Maponya Institute, shaping those conversations, creating the forum for people to meet. And thirdly, and this is the last time you are hearing it tonight, we need catalysts and amplifiers. These are the individuals and organizations who are the trend spotters, who see linkages and work to make them happen, who can connect the dots between the myriad of activities going on, and more importantly, who will buy into existing programs and amplify the message of that program, expanding the reach instead of seeking to develop their own program. We already have a surfeit of program. What we don't have is programs that will run on scale. And what we need is something that will run on scale. And in conclusion, there's a saying that you can either choose to go big or to go home. With collaboration and coordination, we can ensure that existing programs achieve more impact. That's going big. And we should go big. If we consider what is at stake, I submit that going home is not an option. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much to Mr. Tope Toogun. I think there was a lot of wise words shared, a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and if you guys still find time to network after this, I'm sure you have some great questions that you'd like to ask him. I think just in summary, a very profound analysis that I drew from that was simply from the movie Toy Story. I don't know how many of you guys have seen Toy Story. Right, the very first one, like, I think my parents watched it a million times because we asked them to. And Toy Story, for me, I was thinking, like, you know, that's really what entrepreneurship is like. Buzz Lightyear spends the entire movie believing he can fly. And everyone else is like, it's not a real thing, you're a toy. And then in the end, he realizes he can't fly and he's super depressed. And everyone's like, oh, shame, Buzz, you'll be fine. And then afterwards, he figures out that he can still manipulate the air with his wings. And so his friends, so Woody and Buzz are escaping the neighbor's house. And they're flying. And Woody says to him, oh, Buzz, look, you're flying. And Buzz goes, I'm not flying, Woody. I'm falling with style. And I think entrepreneurs are the people that know how to fall with style. And that needs to be okay. Even when your families are confused and everybody else doesn't really know what's going on, the community of toys, and you had really great examples, so it's silly to compare it to Toy Story. But for me, I'm just like, that is really what community is.